But that's not the only weird story that's coming around this morning about what happened in Westminster and behind closed doors at Downing Street. Nadine Dorries is on the front page of the Daily Mail this morning, and she's, of course, joining us here at TalkTV at 8 o'clock tonight, Friday night, with Nadine, right after Plank of the Week. This is the headline, and I want you to think about this as you digest the words. Shadowy Tory number 10 fixer who had pet rabbit butchered in mafia-style warning to his ex-girlfriend. I really don't know what to make of that. So in order to try and figure it all out, I'm going to ask our good friend and former Tory advisor, Mr. Leon Emirali. Leon, welcome to the Independent Republic. I don't know where to begin, really. This guy called Dr. No.
Yeah.
If he didn't exist, you might have to invent him to blame him for everything that's gone wrong in Downing Street, because I've got this image now of this character that sort of appears behind the curtain whenever something terrible happens, and it's all down to him. Now, I like Nadine Dorries very much. I think she's been a great parliamentarian. She does a great show here at TalkTV. We've talked to each other many times. But what's she going on about here?
It's mad, isn't it? It's a crazy story. Although, you know, look, I'm not doubting Nadine's telling the truth, because there are these weird characters in the shadows of Westminster, and you come across them. I certainly came across them when I worked in Westminster. Frankly, they're just weirdos.
Well, I mean, after watching Dominic Cummings' performance this week at the COVID inquiry, where they were reading out some what might be called fruity texts and WhatsApp messages that he sent, calling basically all and sundry completely useless, moronic and much, much worse besides, he has no, obviously, time for any ministers in the cabinet who have been elected to actually run the country. And he and his cabal of sort of nutters, is what I'm going to call them, seems to have taken over the asylum.
Yeah, and it reminds me, this story with the killing of the pet rabbit, crazy as that sounds, it reminds me a little bit of Gavin Williamson when he was Chief Whip.
Yes.
He used to have a pet tarantula on his desk, and he'd sort of release it when ministers wouldn't vote for him. And you look at this type of behaviour, and you do have to question the type of people that are attracted to politics, because, you know, you've got to be a bit crazy, a bit mad to do this type of stuff.
This is why you're here, though, because you were in there. I mean, I'm not saying at that particular time, but you've been inside the hallowed halls of Downing Street, where most people haven't been. I haven't been either, because I wasn't really a political, journalist as such. So you see what it's like in there. It's almost like a kind of Harry Potter-esque world.
It is.
Where nothing is as it seems. Nobody really knows what somebody else is doing.
Yeah.
The words that somebody utters aren't really what they mean. I mean, it must be quite a weird place to work.
Yeah, it is. And not just Downing Street, but also Westminster. I mean, you know, it really is a strange place to work. And I think you look around and you do sort of sense this great awe of history. You know, you can sort of look and think the history, the decisions that have been taken
I think has an interesting effect on people.
I think it does. It plays into the psyche. But then there are also these, you know, you always have to watch what you say. There's no real friends in politics, I think I found. You know, you're always potentially going to get stabbed in the back by someone who wants your job or your minister's job or whatever it might be. So you're constantly on the back foot. And I think it isn't a particularly nice place to work. And I always joke, I had a full head of hair before I started working at Westminster, and now I don't.
Yes.
So I think everything you need to know.
The one quote that I've sort of remembered out of the story that I read this morning about Nadine Dorries is that the Mail have actually gone to find this family of the girlfriend and found the brother of the girlfriend who apparently owned the rabbit. And he said, by way of what I could describe as confirmation, said, well, all I can tell you is I used to have a rabbit, but I don't now. Which pretty much says that something happened to it.
I think so. I mean, you know, she wouldn't be saying it, I don't think, if it wasn't true.
No, I'm sure the story's true. I'm just sort of staggered at the kind of oddness of it all. I mean, somebody once described to me that Westminster, and particularly the House of Commons, was a bit like what school would have been like if there wasn't a bully, you know, because there were all these kind of rather strange people all running around doing whatever the hell they like, which kind of explains the rather weird behaviour that some of them get up to, you know, the groping, you know, the tractor gate thing, you know, the weirdness of some of the Labour Party MPs and what they get up to. And it's all a very surreal world, which most people in Britain, I think, would have no idea about.
No, I mean, look, I went to a normal school. It was a state school.
Right.
And I went into the Houses of Parliament for the first time, and you look around you, it's all oak-panelled, very grand. And I think it is a little bit like those top private schools, the Eatons, the Harrows of the world. You feel a bit privileged
to be there.
And I think if you're from that world, you probably feel quite comfortable in the Houses of Parliament. If you're not, like I was, you know, like I'm not, you sort of go in there and you think, oh, wow, you're quite intimidated by it.
Well, I mean, I've been in there several dozen times probably now, and I find it quite a sort of awe-inspiring experience just to be in the building, you know, to walk around in there and to go and have a drink in there, or to have lunch, or, you know, to meet people and stuff. I mean, it is a very incredibly brilliant place to work. but everybody's weird.
Yeah.
That's the strangest thing about it.
For sure. And Downing Street in particular, I think, because, you know, because it is off limits, as it were. And you walk up the street and you sort of walk through the famous black door, and it's black and white panel, tiled flooring. And you just sort of look at it and you think, wow, you know, Maggie Thatcher walked through here,
everywhere.
Winston Churchill walked through here. And I think if you are slightly strange, which a lot of people working in politics are, you're sort of beefed up by this sort of power, and it is intoxicating. You certainly do feel
Which
it.
I think gives the explanation for what we've seen this week, does it not, in the COVID inquiry, where people like Matt Hancock, who's been called a proven liar by Dominic Cummings, and pretty much has been painted as a pretty ghastly individual and who should never have been in charge of anything. You get the idea even more that they have no real clue about ordinary men and women, working people in the country, because they're so far removed from it. No,
they are, and I think, you know, Matt Hancock in particular, you know, on the front page of the Mirror, wanting to play God. Who gives him the right to decide who lives and dies? I mean, surely that should have been done on a medical basis. Someone with a medical background should have been making those decisions if we had to. But the fact that he put himself forward for that tells you about the psyche, I think, of the man. Although I did wonder about that, because, you know, Margaret Thatcher, who you mentioned earlier, did famously say, did she not, that, you know, ministers govern and experts advise, or something like that. Ministers decide, advisors advise. Advisors advise, something like that, So I think there can be situations where a political decision, albeit based on medical experts' advice, has to be taken by the politician rather than the medical expert. Because, I mean, of course, the problem with medical experts is you end up with people like Neil Ferguson, who wasn't a medical expert, but who was an expert in putting models together, and he was believed as if he was. This is true. And so people talked about social behaviours and behavioural science as if it was a proper science, when it actually isn't. Yeah, well, quite right. But, I mean, you know, back to that point about whether ministers should be deciding who lives and dies, I mean, does that mean we should have the health secretary stood by every single intensive care bed in the country deciding when to switch off the life support machine? I mean, you make those decisions based on medical, you know, science, and it has to be proper science. You have to trust where that advice is coming from. And I think that's where we've sort of clouded the Petri dish, if you like, since we're going to keep that analogy going. You know, because if people were being absolutely genuinely yes or no, you can do this because science dictates that it won't work otherwise, that'd be one thing. But everything has become clouded. So now you get an expert who comes in and tells you everybody should wear a mask, and you go, why? And it's not based on science, it's based on behavioural science, which is not the same thing. Yeah, and this is the thing with science in a practice. My wife is a scientist, and science, we often think as lay people, it's black or white, it's yes or no. It's not. It isn't. It's constantly evolving, and one scientist might have one set of evidence that another scientist refutes. And, you know, this is the problem with COVID, is it was so fast-moving. You had all these scientists putting out different papers, different studies to say, this, you know, masks are great for you. Ventilators, I mean, they were the big thing at the time, and it turned out actually ventilators aren't much good to people with COVID. So the science changes, the science evolves, and we need ministers who actually recognise that that's how science works. And I think sometimes you get people like Boris Johnson and others who are maybe generalists, but they aren't specialists. So they don't know how science works. No, exactly. And they don't know it can change. And what did you make of Dominic Cummings' appearance? Because after his appearance, he then went onto social media, as he tends to do, and was even more sort of vitriolic about some of the things that he'd said, and particularly about Matt Hancock. But a lot of people have asked me the question, did this guy not sign the Official Secrets Act? I mean, he seems to be very fast and loose with giving out information about what happened behind closed doors. And many people have said to me, is he allowed to do that? Yeah. Well, I don't know. I don't think he is, because a lot of what he's saying is very sensitive. And actually, you know, Dominic Cummings is a very talented individual. I think he thinks in a different way that a lot of other people think. He's quite visionary in his thinking. But he's more used to being in Silicon Valley, I think, than he is in Westminster. Let me just stop you for a moment, because we've got to go live now to Israel, where US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is speaking. He's alongside Israeli President Yitzhak Herzog. The right of the Israelis to defend themselves. And we are hearing from the outside the demonstration of the families. Our heart goes out to them. We understand it. We want their immediate release. And finally, I want to say something with your respect as to the humanitarians, the humanitarian and the international law abiding by the State of Israel. So this is a leaflet which we are sending by over 1,200,000 leaflets to the citizens of Gaza. We've carried out 6 million text messages and 4 million phone calls to the citizens of Gaza according to the rules of international law, where we alerted the citizens in advance, including before the Jabalia attack.
please move out, because as we have the right for self-defense, we want you to go out of the premises from where missiles and guns and bombs and mortars are shelled at our people, and from where the horrendous, atrocious attacks went out. So you move out so we can go in according to international law and defend our people. 6 million text messages and 4 million phone calls and 1.2 million pamphlets and phone calls in addition to all of that speaks for itself as we protect the civilians, moving out to safe zone, giving them the right and necessary humanitarian aid, and enabling ourselves to defend ourselves. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. And it's always good to be back in Israel. These are difficult days, but we're here as we've been and as we will remain in solidarity with Israel. We stand strongly for the proposition that Israel has not only the right, but the obligation to defend itself and to do everything possible to make sure that this October 7th can never happen again. And at the same time, and as you've just made clear, how Israel does this matters, and it is very important that when it comes to the protection of civilians who are caught in a crossfire of Hamas's making, that everything be done to protect them and to bring assistance to those who so desperately need it, and who are not in any way responsible for what happened on October 7th. So we're working on all of that together, but we have a shared determination, and that determination will not wane. We also are thinking every single moment of our hostages. So many Israelis, Americans, other nationals, and we are determined to do everything that we can to bring them back safely, to bring them back to be with their families and loved ones. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go. Yeah, sure.
That's Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, there with Isaac Herzog, the President of Israel. Quite strong words from Blinken there in the company standing next to the President of Israel saying, you know, it's important that Israel does this the right way.
Yeah, I think, and Israel have got this issue at the moment, which is the support for what they're doing is not unanimous in the way that maybe it was with Ukraine, because I think there was a clear aggressor, there was a clear issue with Russia. And I think with what's happened with Israel, because there is a sense of feeling amongst the population that, you know, their response hasn't necessarily been proportionate, that they actually need to demonstrate why they're doing what they're doing. And I think, you know, to have the allies by their side, I think, is really important.
The thing that I worry about slightly, though, is that an awful lot of people's kind of assessment of whether the proportionate response is proportionate are looking at figures that are coming out of Hamas. You know, I haven't heard Israel, and maybe we should hear more from Israel as to what they know about the casualty numbers. Because, I mean, I've heard certainly Israeli officials say, look at what they said about that hospital that was supposed to have been hit with an airstrike. They said 500 people died. It turned out to be 50 people, and it turned out to be not an Israeli airstrike after all. So if all of these numbers that we're hearing, 8,000, 10,000, half of them children, turn out not to be true, you know, that would be a terrible indictment on everybody else in the world who's taken the word of a ghastly, horrendous, medieval terrorist group as far as how many people are being killed.
Yeah, and there's a huge amount of misinformation out there, Mike, that's being spread. And because we've sort of, or the media in a way, have given cover to people who do support Hamas. Because, you know, the BBC
this is the
to
trouble.
call them terrorists.
And if there's only one source of information on numbers of casualties in Palestine, and I'm not suggesting that there aren't innocent people being killed, but there's a war going on, and you've got to be very careful about who you believe, haven't you?
Absolutely. And I think, you know, this is really the modern age of warfare, where in the information war is in many ways just as important as the war on the ground.
Well, it totally is, because it moves markets, it moves countries. I mean, look at what happened when that hospital strike happened and when the BBC reported that it had to be an Israeli missile that struck the hospital. There were massive riots all over the Middle East. You know, Tehran, they were demonstrating outside the British embassy. You know, they were demonstrating in Cairo, demonstrating in all manner of different parts of the world, Turkey, I think, as well, and London. So they've got to be so careful. But listen, we've got to move on. Leon, great to see you. Thank you very much indeed. I guess there's no chance of your hair growing back if you get a job in a more sensible place.
Maybe I'll have to go off to Turkey and get a hair transplant.
Maybe so. Yeah, that's a good idea. Leon Emirali there, giving us the benefit of his knowledge of the way that things work inside of Downing Street and inside the corridors of power, because it really is quite a bizarre situation.